I think a good place to start is talk about the day in 2004 where you had a panic attack on national television. Like, what exactly happened throughout that day?
Well, I was on Good Morning America, so I woke up at 4 a.m, and I was filling in that day for a woman named Robin Roberts, who's now the main anchor of the show. And at that time, she had a job that we don't have this position anymore on any of the morning shows, but many of the morning shows used to have this person called the newsreader, who, the main hosts at the time for GMA was Diane Sawyer and Charlie Gibson, and then there would Robin, who would come on at the top of each hour and read some headlines. And Robin was out that morning and I was filling in for her, and I had done this before, so I wasn't, nervous in particular. And a couple of seconds into my 7 o'clock news hit, I lost the ability to breathe, which is pretty deeply inconvenient if you're trying to anchor the news. And my palms were sweating, my lungs seized up, my heart was racing. And then, of course, my mind was racing like, dude, what's going on? And luckily for me, I was able to toss it back to the main hosts of the show, Charlie and Diane, and get out of there. But it was horrifying. And I'd had panic attacks before, but not this strong of a panic attack, and not on television in this way. So it was really, really, really uncomfortable. And I thought it was going to destroy my career. But it turned out I was okay. I kind of just, honestly, I don't love admitting this, but I kind of just lied to everybody and said I was fine. And then I was able to come back on at the 8 o'clock hour and do my shtick with no panic.
And you mentioned that you had some panic attacks and anxiety before. From my own experience with anxiety and just understanding the brain chemistry behind it, the more stressed you are, I feel like can make anxiety much worse and can make the symptoms of anxiety more intense. Were you at that time, were you incredibly stressed or burned out at that point in your career? What do you, looking back now, what do you think was causing all of it?
Cocaine.
Really?
I mean, that's a bit of a glib answer, but if you want to go slightly deeper, I had spent a lot of time in my early 30s in war zones after 9/11. So this was all happening many years ago, and I'm 53 now. So after 9/11, I was in 31 or something like that, maybe just 30. And I ended up in Afghanistan and Iraq and places like that. And when I came home after one of many trips, I was having a lot of trouble getting out of bed, and I felt kind of sick all the time. And I was at a party, and a friend of mine offered cocaine, and I'd never actually done any hard drugs. I'd smoked weed and drank, but I was just feeling like, and I thought, I'll just try cocaine, and it made me feel better. Of course, the hangover is atrocious, but in the moment, it made me feel better. So I started doing it, not all the time. I wasn't using it every day, but I would party once in a while. And it was enough so that after the panic attack, I went to a shrink. He asked me a bunch of questions. One of the questions was, do you do drugs? And I was like, oh, yeah, I do. And he was like, yeah, dummy, mystery solved. And he was like, yeah, I wasn't high on the air, but my ambient use of cocaine every other weekend or whatever it was changed my brain chemistry, degraded my sort of overall physical and mental health. And that's an environment in which panic can thrive.
Right. That's wild. Yeah, obviously I know cocaine can cause anxiety. I didn't know that just doing it every other weekend can change your brain chemistry that much that it would literally cause something as intense as a panic attack, even when you weren't using it.
Well, it's super individual, right? And I think the way that my doctor at the time described it to me was that, if you have panic disorder, and I had panicked, just to be clear, before I had panic attacks. My first were when I was 14 or 15 smoking weed. And then I had a few near misses on the air during my career where I felt the panic, but was able to keep my shit together. So if you have a propensity for panic, my doctor's argument was, then you really need to be doing all the annoying things like getting a lot of sleep, exercising, eating well, not doing drugs. He used an animal analogy with me to describe how I needed to really take care of myself. And I remember a couple of years later, I said, remember that time you said I need to treat myself like a stallion? He was like, no, dude, I said thoroughbred. But of course, I heard stallion. But his point is a thoroughbred horse, very, you really need to do a lot of care and feeding with a thoroughbred horse. And his point is that if you have the potential for anxiety or panic, you really want to make sure that your nervous system is in equilibrium. And so cocaine for me was not a helpful contributor.
And so you're doing blow. That's like negatively impacting your nervous system, your ability to self-regulate. You're filling in for Good Morning America. You have this massive panic attack on air. What were some of your other habits like? What was your sleep like? What was your diet like then? What was your exercise routine like? I mean, were you just completely burned out in all ways?
No, actually, I mean, I was incredibly fit, actually. It was still early to mid 30s, and I wasn't married and didn't have a kid. So I would spend 2 hours a day in the gym. So I was actually really, really fit at that time. I think other than nights when I was partying, my sleep was pretty much intact too. So it wasn't like I was running myself. I worked incredibly hard, but I wasn't strung out in that way. I think that it was really about using drugs once in a while.
And then what was the like remission process like after that? I mean, I would imagine there was a lot of like shame and embarrassment. What was that whole thing like after that happened?
I was really scared. I was embarrassed for sure, but I was really scared that it was going to destroy my career because I knew I had gotten through the morning in that my bosses didn't figure it out and I was able to do the next hit, news. I was able to do the next appearance an hour later. So I knew I'd dealt with that. But my fear was that if I'm now vulnerable to panic every time I go on television, that's not going to be good for my career because I go on television for a living. I was really worried about that. And then also once it became clear that the cocaine was part of it, well, that brought with it's a whole set of issues too. Like, okay, now I need to stop doing drugs. Stopping drugs is not easy, as you, I think, know. I didn't have to go to rehab, but the doctor wanted me to come see him once or twice a week indefinitely, which I did, I think, for like 10 years until he got booted upstairs. And now I see a different therapist. But my point being that the recovery period was not easy.
No. And so like what were some of the first things you did to help alleviate like the anxiety and the fear of panic when you were being on air the next time?
There are two things. Well, I guess three things I did. One is I started therapy, which was very helpful. The second two involve medication. He gave me Klonopin, which is a benzodiazepine, sort of an anti-anxiety medication that I took sort of every day for a long time. I don't take it anymore, except in what the physicians call PRN, like as needed. I will take a Klonopin if I have to get on a plane and I'm worried about panicking or something like that, but I'm not on a standing dose of it. But honestly, the most helpful thing, and I think this is something almost anybody can do, is a medication called, it's a class of medications known as beta blockers. And they're non-narcotics. So unlike Klonopin or an anti-anxiety medication, which can get you high in essence, beta blocker it just puts a ceiling on how fast, how rapidly your heart can beat. And so many people in the performing arts, and actually even some surgeons who need to perform in a way, will take beta blockers because it does prevent the physiological aspects of panic. And so for me, as somebody who was a news anchor, it was as close to a silver bullet as I've ever experienced, that I just knew that my body could not mutiny that hard. I could be nervous in my head, and sure, I mean, I could have sweaty palms or whatever, but like the full on panic was not really on the menu anymore. And that just gave me a ton of confidence.
How long did it take for you to like have this solution to the point where you were able to no longer have panic and anxiety while on air? Was this like a week? Was it 2 weeks? Was it a month? Like how long did it take?
Not long. I mean, the combination of Klonopin, and honestly, I could have skipped the Klonopin. It was the beta blocker was really the thing. Just knowing is very hard to go into full on panic if you got a beta blocker on board. That just made a huge difference. And that didn't take long.
And you mentioned like still having to take stuff now as needed. What was your relationship to anxiety like over the last 2 decades since the panic attack on air?
It's interesting. I still have a baseline level of anxiety. I think I'm just sort of wired for anxiety, but meditation and many of the other modalities I've explored, now that I'm, I guess, like a quasi self-help guru, have really changed my relationship to anxiety. It's still there, but it's not as powerful. Having said that, life is filled with ups and downs, even if you're in the wellness space. And I have had this stressful thing in my life for the last couple of years where I've been in this separation from a company that I co-founded. One of the things that happened after I got into meditation was I co-founded a meditation app called 10% Happier, which was named after a book I wrote on the subject. And I ended up having a split with my co-founders, and that just caused me an enormous amount of stress and anxiety, and my panic attacks came back. Most noticeably, they were happening on airplanes and elevators anytime I felt like trapped or claustrophobic. And my new psychiatrist was like, yeah, it's not hard to imagine why you would feel trapped in your work life. And so this is showing up in your mental and psychological life. And yeah, I was having these panic attacks on planes. And so now I will take Klonopin if I have to fly. I don't take it every time I need to get in an elevator, but those are definitely uncomfortable experiences for me often. The good news is exposure therapy, which I suspect you know something about, which is kind of managed and manageable doses of adversity, to use a resonant term for you, does help. When my panic attacks started coming back, I would ride an elevator at the Westchester Mall outside of New York City with my therapist just to get my mind and my brain and my body used to being in that environment. And that really helped. Problem is, my life now does not involve a ton of flying or elevators because I moved to the suburbs and I'm not a journalist anymore. So I'm not getting, one of the struggles I have is I don't get as much exposure as I need to the things that terrify me. And so sometimes I will use medication as a bridge. I'm not a huge fan of medication just because benzodiazepines like Klonopin and Xanax can be addictive, and I have an addictive personality. So I really prefer to do something like exposure therapy as opposed to taking medications. But medications can be an effective bridge.
I'd love to hear more about why you think exposure therapy was so beneficial for you and why it can be for others, because I think one of the hardest things when you're having anxiety or a panic attack is these physical symptoms. And one of the things that made mine worse was when I would have like a racing heart rate and the tingliness, my face would feel like numb, like I just snorted like an 8-ball of Coke. Like it would feel like I was literally dying. And the more I panicked about those feelings, the worse my anxiety got because my body was like in fight or flight survival mode. And then when I learned to, I read that book called Dare in my 20s that I told you that I read, that was like, you have to like invite the anxious feelings like almost into your life. And that saved me. It really did, because it taught me that the feelings weren't going to kill me. They were just there to protect me, and that my nervous system was just jacked up and I had to find a way to self-regulate. I mean, a psychiatrist of mine in my 20s had said, and I'll give it back to you, was having a panic attack was like is like trying to jump out of a burning building that's not burning, right? It's like that's what it feels like. Talk about why exposure therapy you think is so beneficial for people.
Well, I mean, you said it beautifully that the answer really is learning to tolerate the discomfort, because the panic is not going to kill you. The problem is your brain believes you are dying, or part of your brain believes you're dying. The amygdala, the sort of ancient fear-based part of the brain that is in the rear of the skull, that's sometimes called the lizard brain because it's the part of the brain that we share with lots of other animals. But the human brain also has the prefrontal cortex, which is where rationality and creativity and focus lives, and that's behind your forehead. And if you can bring the prefrontal cortex online, takes the amygdala offline. And so what exposure therapy does is gives you a dose of the thing you're afraid of that's manageable and safe, that gets you habituated to it in a good way. And then you can start to access the rational part of your brain that will be like, yeah, you can survive these feelings. You've had these feelings 1,000 times and you're still here. There's no actual danger. As my shrink says, or as your shrink says, this is like jumping out of a burning building that isn't burning. You're fine. All of that really can help, but it requires, I think, something that we don't have enough of in our society right now, which is the willingness to seek out and tolerate adversity and discomfort.
Yeah, it's tough because you really are convinced in those moments that you are dying. and then you are like in serious danger. I mean, I told you when I was a kid and I was in the emergency room, when I was like, I don't know, I think I was like maybe 19 or 20, something like that. And it was like, I had no reason to be in the emergency room as a kid that age, but I had convinced myself so much that I was dying. And I was also high on a bunch of drugs. So that obviously exacerbated things and didn't help. But I remember my friends looking at me. I'm like strapped. I'm like on I don't know if I was on a stretcher, but some bed in an ambulance. I'm like, Doug, you live like right across the street. Like you're fine. Like, what are you talking about? You're dying. And they didn't understand. I honestly didn't understand what was going on until like learning more about it. But I do think it's just incredibly challenging for people to get comfortable with those uncomfortable feelings. I think the other problem that will end up persisting, and I'd love to get like your experience on this, is if you don't embrace that discomfort and you just push it away and you say, you know what, like I have a panic attack every time I go in the elevator, so I'm just not going to get in an elevator anymore. I have a panic attack every time I go to the grocery store, so I'm not going to go to the grocery store anymore. Like that just like pushes the ball further and further down. And now you're living this life where you're not even leaving, your place sometimes. I mean, I didn't get to that point, but I had experiences of like, okay, I had a panic attack when I was doing this. So the next time I do that, I'm going to have a panic attack. Talk a bit about your experience with, I don't know if it's a phobia, but like the fear of future panic attacks, what that was like, and then how this exposure therapy really helped.
But that's the issue, fear of fear. And at that point, you're kind of, it's like your life just gets smaller and smaller. You're not living your life fully because you're worried that you might panic. And I know exactly what that feels like. I have that temptation too. Like it would be easier for me right now to say I'm never going to get on an elevator or an airplane ever again because I hate the way it feels. But that would really diminish the quality of my life. And I think then it's a slippery slope where, okay, maybe then I start panicking in public speaking, which I obviously have a history of doing. Well, then I'm not going to do that anymore. Then I can't make a living. And then where does that head? It heads to a real diminishment of your life. So it sucks, but it is in your best interest to face the fear head on, but in a careful, managed way with a good therapist who can give you the right dosage of it. Then it's like an incredibly empowering thing. It's like, oh, yeah, I can handle this. And that realization of I can handle this is scalable to so many aspects of your life. You can handle so many more things than your self-limiting stories would suggest.
And so clearly, like overcoming adversity is like a massive theme of the show. And I think what you're sharing is very relatable, whether or not people have panic attacks or not, in that in order to get better at something, you need to work at it. You need to put yourself out there. It's like a muscle. Like in order to get better at, riding an elevator, you need to work that elevator riding muscle, as silly as that may, sound. Or in order to get better at public speaking, you need to work that public speaking muscle. In order to work on getting better at communicating with people, you need to work that communication muscle. And a lot of people have trouble with the flavor of what we're talking about right now. What advice do you have for the person that is constantly not putting themselves out there because of the fear of what's on the other side of that?
What is it? I think this is a Brene Brown expression, embrace the suck. It's like you want to do anything worthwhile in your life, aspects of it will suck. So what's the alternative? You're going to live a small, unambitious life, or are you going to, nobody promised us that this being alive thing was going to be easy, right? And part of the problem here really is, and we see this particularly among younger people, and I don't want to sound like some cranky, I'm 53, I don't want to sound like some cranky old, get off my lawn criticizing millennials and Gen. I actually have no criticisms of millennials and Gen Z. I think the problem is my generation and the boomers above me created a world in which young people don't get enough adversity. Through our phones, we've made getting a ride, getting food, getting groceries, getting information so easy. And many parents, and I sometimes wonder whether I'm guilty of this as the father of a 9-year-old, we are helicopter parenting. We are not letting kids play on their own. And this creates a kind of allergy to adversity, discomfort with discomfort. And that's a real problem. We need to inoculate ourselves against this. A healthy life involves, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, involves adversity and being able to deal with it. And so, yeah, I would say my advice is embrace the suck. Easier than it sounds. I'm not trying to make it sound easier to say than to do. I'm not trying to poo-poo how hard it is. I'm just saying consider the alternative. The alternative is an unambitious, small life. And I don't think you, and I'm talking to the listener, I don't think you want that.
I just made a post today actually about like you got to choose your tough. Like reaching a goal, changing your life takes a lot of hard work, effort, discipline, sacrifice. Times where you might not sleep as much, might take you cutting certain people out of your life in order to get better. Those are all challenging things, but regret is also very painful. If you're somebody that's like 20 years down the road and looks back like, man, like I wish I would have done this then. I wish I would have changed then. And I look at what you said in my own life. Like I look at like the fact that I order so much stuff on Amazon because of the gratification of it arriving tomorrow or in 2 days. And I'm like, oh, like I don't have to wait and just go to the store or go to a retail store whenever I have the time. Amazon will deliver it the next day or two. Or even like if I want food, there's an app that'll bring me food and I can track where the person is. Or if I want to know how to get somewhere, I can just whip out the Waze app and it directs me how to go. And I just look back at where I was when I was 16, 17 and first got my license. And it's like, oh, I had to actually use a map and look at where things were. And I had to drive places and there was no cell phone where you could just have anything you want with the ease of just pressing a button. And I'm sure it's negatively impacted me in some way. I mean, not to the extent where I now don't pursue hard things, but it's definitely working that instant gratification muscle, I think, a little bit more than I need to.
And imagine if you were younger. I mean, I'm guessing early 40s?
36. But the beard, I know, the
36.
white,
My bad,
the
my
white
bad.
in the beard,
It wasn't basing it on how you look. I was basing it on your age when you started having panic attacks in 2005. So I'm just bad at math. Anyway, imagine if you grew up like my son will grow up in an era where instant gratification, automated through your phone, is all you've ever known. And we have a culture where kids don't play outside in an unstructured, unsupervised way anymore, the way they did when I was a kid. And again, I am not blaming young people for this. This is a result of the world that people my age and older created. So this is not a critique of the younger generation. It's just pointing out a problem that we need to work with and figure out how to get the right amount of adversity into young people's lives, because it's a skill you need. Non-negotiably, you need. Life is hard. Here, let me just tell you something obvious, but people don't think about it much. You're going to die. Everybody you know is going to die. Everybody you know is going to get sick at some point. We live in a universe where the pace of change is relentless, and to use this word, non-negotiable. If you can't handle this, you're going to suffer. And even for people like me who have experiencing adversity, and for never mind people like who I've had a charmed life. I mean, but there are plenty of people all over the planet who've experienced plenty of adversity, and even they struggle with these hard facts of life. But if you've got no taste of how to overcome, if you have no resiliency, then these unavoidable truths of life are going to throw you. And yeah, so we need to train it early and often.
Totally. And so what are some of the things you do on either a daily or a weekly basis to work your adversity muscle?
It's funny you ask this. I do so many practices, but I think my ability to deal with adversity is never, I mean, I'm just thinking about this for the first time. It's never been one of my big areas of weakness. I have many, many weaknesses. Most of the practices that I do are designed to keep me calm in the face of external and internal stimuli, or to boost my warmth quotient, given that I'm by nature, a kind of frosty New Englander, boost my capacity for gratitude and generosity. So I haven't thought much about how to handle adversity because, and again, I don't want to overstate the amount of adversity I've had in my life. I have had a very charmed life, but I have had adversity. I've been a combat correspondent. I've had anxiety and depression since I was a little kid. I was bullied when I was a little kid, and I was a bully. And so I've had a lot of experiences that I think have trained me for this. So this is a long way of saying I don't get up in the morning and think, what can I do today to help me handle future adversity? Because I have other issues that I am working on instead. But for people who are really do want to get better at adversity, first of all, I think it is about, having the consistent, deliberate practice of embracing the suck, of recognizing that anything big you want to do, and I do encourage you to set big, lofty goals, is going to involve hard work, and to not run away from that, instead run toward it. Another thing is some of the practices that I do, like meditation, will help you with handling adversity. Meditation, when we can talk about how to do it, but it is essentially mindfulness meditation is about helping you have a different relationship to your thoughts and urges and emotions. And if you're struggling with handling adversity, that struggle will take the form of thoughts and urges and emotions. So you having this practice where you learn how to navigate your own mind more skillfully in a more supple way, definitely, I think, will help with adversity. And then the final thing I'd say, and I think this is almost universally overlooked in the self-help world, and also irrefutable when it comes to the evidence. If you want to get better at handling adversity, at boosting your resiliency, the most powerful lever to pull is rarely talked about on Instagram, and it's the quality of your relationships. Think about how, and that can sound very hallmarky or woo-woo or soft or whatever, but it's based in hard science. I love this scientific example I'm about to give you from science. The longest running study in all of science, I believe, is something called the Harvard Study for Adult Development. It has tracked several generations of people in the Boston area. And the goal of the study, which I think started 90 years ago, roughly 90 years ago, the goal of the study was to figure out what are the variables that lead people to live long and happy and healthy and successful lives. And what comes screaming out of the data is that the number one variable is not whether you've achieved ketosis or how many steps you're getting or how much sleep you're getting or whatever. All of those are important, but the number one variable is the quality of your relationships. Why? Because stress, which of course can be caused by adversity and other things, but stress is what kills us, most of us. And what modulates stress is positive relationships with other people, family, friends, coworkers. Again, if you think this sounds soft, consider how we evolved. We did not become the apex predator on this planet because we have tusks or claws or the size of an elephant. We got to the top of the food chain because we have this ability to cooperate, collaborate, and communicate. If you don't have people in your life who can calm you down and talk you through tough, you are going to really struggle to handle tough. And so my number one piece of advice would be something I heard from this guy, Dr. Robert Waldinger, who is the current overseer of the Harvard Study for Adult Development. He's the third guy to run this thing because it's gone on so long and people die. A little expression I heard from him is never worry alone. And I think if you can embrace the suck and turn toward the difficulty in your life, if you can use meditation to manage your own mind in the face of whatever comes up, you're cultivating healthy relationships in your friend group, your work life, and your family to help you not worry alone. I feel like that's a pretty good recipe. What do you think as somebody who thinks about this a lot?
I interviewed Mark Schultz, who's the assistant director of the study. So there's Dr. Waldinger and then there's Mark. I interviewed Mark. And yeah, I mean, I think there's that old self-help quote from Jim Rohn that's like, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I think your environment creates a false sense of normalcy. And I talk about this a lot because when I was a drug addict, I thought it was normal to be like snorting an 8-ball of Coke every day and doing a bunch of oxy and selling a bunch of weed because everybody around me was also doing it. So I thought it was normal. I didn't know anything else. It's like the alcoholic who goes to the bar from 11 to 7 every day and comes home to his or her spouse and is like, hey, like, what's up? And they're like, where you been? Like, you're drunk, you've been drinking all day. And he's like, what? I don't have a problem. Everybody else is doing it. It's like and so you develop that mindset by spending time with the wrong people. And I noticed this firsthand when I got out of jail and I was into health and fitness and I had just started to change my life. I started to spend time with my old friends because I had known them since, grade school. And it felt like an awkward first date, Dan, because I was like, I have nothing in common with these people. They were like more curious about when the next time they were going to get high and stuff was. And I was more concerned with, when's my next protein meal going to come, and how am I going to read more about wellness? And I say this because one of the things that I talk about a lot on the podcast is you got to spend time with people who have common futures and not common pasts. And the importance of that, I think, is so paramount, because if you don't, I think you will suffer. If you're somebody that wants to transform your life and improve your mental health, and you're hanging around a bunch of people that are negative and doing drugs all the time and not pursuing things like health and wellness and personal development, like, I think you will suffer and you'll have a hard time. So it's a long-winded answer of saying yes. Like, I personal relationships are incredibly meaningful to me today. I wouldn't be where I am without my friends and mentors and certain members of my family. And yeah, I mean, I echo everything you just said. It's like, I think the most important thing that often gets overlooked, because you can work out all day long, you can go to therapy, you can do all the things, but if your relationships suck, I mean, the road is going to be very miserable, lonely, and you're just not going to stack up the way you should.
I agree with everything you just said. What it got me thinking about was something that the Buddha said. Yeah, so I'm that kind of guy now. I quote the Buddha. Whatever you think of Buddhism, it's a 2,600-year-old tradition that developed many meditation practices that are now being validated by modern science. And so to me, it's quite a compelling tradition. And the Buddha, who started it all, talked about the three jewels, or the three, pillars of a good life. One of them, immodestly, was the Buddha. But basically, he was saying what's important in Buddhism, you want to have an example of what is possible. So the Buddha is one pillar. The second is the Dharma, which is the teachings of the Buddha. And the third is community. Right up there with the Buddha and the teachings of the Buddha is the community. That's a pretty big +1 from one of the most robust wisdom traditions on the planet, that if you want to get anywhere in your mind and your life, you need to, this is a team sport.
This episode is brought to you by Element. Whether or not you're working out, hydration is so important. Water alone is key, but drinking water on its own sometimes just doesn't cut it. That's where Element electrolytes come in. They have formulated a science-backed electrolyte ratio that tastes absolutely amazing. Plus, doesn't have any sugar, artificial colors, or other sketchy ingredients to hold you back. I've been using Element for years, and my favorite flavor is definitely the citrus salt. I take it either first thing in the morning when I wake up, or after a workout or a run. After taking it, I always feel replenished and ready to move on to the next thing I am doing. I know when I am properly hydrated, I perform and feel my best. So if you're looking to optimize your hydration, go to drinklmnt.com/DougBopst to get a free sample pack with any purchase. Again, go to drinklmnt.com/DougBopst or click the link below for a free sample pack with any purchase. Now back to the show. And so we've talked about the importance of relationships over the last few minutes and how that can really improve somebody's overall well-being and mental health. Other than like the things you described, exposure therapy, medication, I guess just time, like what are some things that help you manage your anxiety? Like if you're doing these things, your anxiety is pretty much at bay.
Yeah, so I think of like 7, I sometimes call them the pantheon of no-brainers. Sometimes I can't remember all 7, but I'll do my best to list them. Sleep is incredibly important. Nothing good can happen if you haven't slept. Exercise, movement is really great, really important, with the asterisk that you don't want to get too obsessive about it. A road I have gone down. The third is eating or healthy diet. Same asterisk. Probably even more important here. It's very easy to start developing an unhealthy relationship with food, but of course, within reason, you want to eat healthy. I think there should be plenty of room for donuts as well. So again, the first 3: sleep, exercise, diet. I would put meditation pretty high on the list, or some practice that can help you train your mind. I think meditation is a really important variable here. Nature is really important. Therapy and or medication. And then I think I end the list with the most important, which is relationships. If you've got some degree of commitment on each of these, I believe you are protecting yourself against anxiety. There's no guarantees in life. Anxieties are really persistent, and of course panic too, both persistent and insidious habits of mind. But if you're pursuing these 7 avenues, I do think you're going to protect yourself.
Yeah, and everybody's looking for ways to reduce stress, panic, anxiety in the fastest way possible. And you've talked about like some ways that you've done that for yourself and some of the habits you've instilled. The main ones that I guess you're known for now and that you've touched on is meditation and mindfulness. You started a whole like next level career out of that. A lot of people, including myself over the years, have struggled with meditation because it can be hard to sit still. It can be challenging for the average person who's like, hey, I want to get better at managing stress. I want to get better at anxiety. I want to get better at sleep. How can they start using things like meditation and mindfulness to be effective?
Well, first thing to say is you don't have to do this. I'm not a big fan of shoulds. I think there's a lot of evidence that's really good for you, but you can live very happy, non-stressed, non-anxious life without meditating. I just want to be clear about that. I'm not a big fan of people who are overly like dogmatic and sweaty and put too much pressure on. The other thing to say is if you've struggled with meditation, that's completely normal. And I think if we go under the hood, depending on what your struggles are, I could probably help you get over the hump and actually do it. So some of the most common struggles are, one, I can't find the time. And so to that, I would say, do 1 minute. And you don't even have to do it every day. I like to talk about how it's great to start with 1 minute daily-ish. And we know from the research around habit formation that one of the best ways to establish a habit is to start small. And just to say on this issue of habit formation, it's almost universally hard. Almost everybody struggles to establish habits. So just knowing that should be liberating, because many of us struggle with something like meditation or exercise, and then we tell ourselves a whole story about how we are uniquely dysfunctional in this regard. But that's just not true. This is a almost universal dysfunction, to the point where I don't even think we can call it a dysfunction. It's just the way we are, and we need to find workarounds. Another thing to know about meditation, and I think another thing that people really struggle with, is many people have tried it and found that they're getting distracted a lot. And then they're telling themselves a whole story about how they're failed meditators because they're getting distracted a lot. I have a very satisfying, I think, answer to this, which is, and maybe I'll just step back and describe how you do basic mindfulness meditation very, very quickly, which is there are only really 3 steps for basic mindfulness meditation. The first is sit somewhere reasonably quiet. If it's noisy, you can put noise canceling headphones in or play some white noise through your headphones, whatever. Just find someplace that's reasonably quiet. Sit comfortably. You can lie down if you want. You can sit in a chair. You can fold yourself into a pretzel, whatever is good for you. The second step is bring your full attention to the feeling of your breath coming in and going out. It doesn't have to be controlled breathing or deep breathing. It's just your breath as it naturally occurs. It can help to pick one spot, like your belly rising or the air coming in and out of your nose. If the breath makes you anxious, because that's true for some people, then you can pick something else to focus on, like the feeling of your body sitting or sounds in the environment. Basically, just sitting in a reasonably quiet place, trying to find one neutral thing to focus on, your breath or the sounds or the feeling in your body. So those are the first 2 steps. And the third step is the most important. As soon as you try to do this seemingly easy thing, your mind is likely to go into mutiny mode, and you're going to be having all sorts of crazy thoughts. What's for lunch? Where do gerbils run wild? Whatever. And the whole game is just to notice when you've become distracted and to start again and again and again. This is like a bicep curl for your brain. One of the thoughts we often have when we notice how distracted we are is, I suck at this. I'm uniquely unqualified to do meditation. But that's not true. It's just another thought. The truth is, waking up from distraction is proof not of failure, but success. Clearing your mind is impossible unless you're enlightened or dead. And so I think just knowing that you don't have to clear your mind, that getting distracted is part of the deal, and that waking up is proof of success, is really liberating. And why is that proof of success? Because the more familiar you get with the fact that you have thoughts, that you have a mind and are thinking all the time, then the less owned you are by all of the ideas that are popping into your head. And you're not, just blindly acting out all of your thoughts like they're little dictators, as my meditation teacher likes to say. You might have a thought of, oh yeah, I'm going to say something right now that will ruin the next 48 hours of my marriage. But you don't actually have to say the thing. That you can have the thought come up in your mind and then let it go. And that is the value of sitting in meditation for a minute or 2 every day or every other day, and seeing how wild your mind is and starting again. That is the fruit of meditation. And then the final thing to say is, if you have trouble sitting still, do walking meditation. I'm a huge fan of walking meditation. And so how do you do that? Just stake out a patch of land in your apartment or your house or whatever, or you can do it outside, maybe 10 yards, maybe 5 yards, whatever, and just walk back and forth. This is a long trip to nowhere. Walk back and forth very slowly and try to bring your full attention to the feeling of your body as you're moving. And every time you get distracted, you start again and again. One little hack here is you can use a soft mental note in your mind of lift, if your foot lifting, move, place, lift, move, place. And then every time you get distracted, you start again. This is a great form of practice and really good for people with ADHD who have trouble sitting still. And yeah, just those are three things I would say to somebody who's struggling to meditate. I think even if you've told yourself a story you can't do it, you actually can.
How long do you typically meditate for every single day now?
Today it got away from me, but I try to sit for about an hour a day. I want to be clear. I'm like a semi-pro meditator at this point. I write books about it, host a podcast. If you hire a trainer, you want that person to be doing Tough Mudders or Ironman competitions. They don't necessarily have to be doing those things, but you want them to have done a lot of training. And so as a meditation evangelist myself, I use that term somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I want to have a commitment to doing a non-trivial amount of practice. But that doesn't mean that you, Doug, or anybody listening needs to be doing that amount. I just, it's really a huge part of my life. But I didn't start with an hour a day. I started with 5 minutes.
Shifting gears, your latest podcast episode is titled, I Just Went Through a Career Earthquake. Here's what I learned about anger, insomnia, and bouncing back. Talk about that, how you've dealt with the anxiety, the stress, everything that's come from it.
Yeah, so that was a podcast episode I posted. Usually I have guests, but this was just me talking for about a half hour about what we talked about before, the fact that I've had this very painful, wrenching split with my co-founders at the meditation app. And those are good guys, by the way. It's not, they're very well-intentioned people. So there's no bad guy here. But it was very hard. I don't know how it was for them. I'm assuming it was hard for them too, but I can only speak for myself, which it was really, really hard. My hair got a lot grayer. My sleep was deeply interrupted. My panic attacks came back during this period. It was very, very, one of the hardest things I've ever gone through. And I learned a lot of lessons. I learned about, as you said, handling anger and insomnia. And on the bouncing back tip, I just started a new company and basically a community over on danharris.com, and it's powered by Substack. So if you go to Substack and search for me, you can find it, or if you just type danharris.com into your browser. And essentially what I'm doing is two things. One is if you listen to the podcast, which a lot of people do, I'm going to give bonus content to help you actually do the shit we talk about in the podcast in your own life. And I'm creating a community of people who take this seriously. And I think this is a problem that you pointed to this when you got out of prison. You didn't have anybody in your world who cared about the stuff that you cared about, self-improvement. And I think it's very common that, people get interested in, on my show, we talk about meditation, but lots of other things like sleep and exercise, all of the pantheon of no-brainers that I mentioned earlier. We talk about all aspects of what I call doing life better. And it's not uncommon for people who are interested in this stuff not to know other people who are also interested in it. And so I want to create a community where you can talk to me, you can talk to the guests on my show, you can talk to one another and have social support. That's a psychological term, but we're talking about creating habits earlier. One of the big things that we've seen in the data in terms of what helps people form habits is having what's called social support. In other words, knowing other people who do the same thing. That's what I'm working on now. And failure is hard. Talk about adversity. The company, by the way, is not a failure. The company will keep going without me. The app will keep going without me. They've changed the name to Happier. And when I use the word failure, I'm really only referring to my role in all of this. Failure is really hard. And resiliency is on offer. And I really have seen that. The failure of my involvement with the meditation app has forced me to do a lot of experimentation and risk-taking that has resulted in this new company. And I'm super excited about it. And the reason why I'm talking about it so long is not just because I want you to join it and I'm being self-promotional, but also because I want to make the point that whether you join it or not, if you have struggles in your own life, if you have career earthquakes or personal earthquakes, you can recover. And in fact, often there are opportunities for like massive, massive growth. Your story, Doug, is a great example of that. Drug addiction, jail, get out, Now you have a popular podcast. You've got a level of physical and mental wellness you did not have previously. And that happened because you shit the bed. And it's a strange position to be in, but I'm kind of pro failure at this point.
And a lot of people don't have this beautiful relationship with failure. And the whole idea, one of the main things around the adversity advantage is I wanted to talk to people like you and help people understand that just because something bad happens in their life, it doesn't give them an excuse to just pour gasoline on the existing fire and just disrupt their life so that they can blame the initial problem for ruining their life. It's like, no, your habits and behaviors following that is what ruin your life long term. What did you do like over the last few years that kept you like super focused on your own mental health and well-being that helped mitigate a lot of the existing mental health issues that arise from the separation?
Honestly, I just followed my own advice. The 7 things I listed before, exercise, sleep, meditation, diet, having good social relationships, getting outside, therapy. I just followed my own advice and it all really helped. One other thing to say that's been really helpful for me, and I don't think a lot of people think about this, is thinking about what motivates you. Like, why are you doing what you do? And for me, for sure, I'm a human, so I like money and clout and all that stuff. And that's true for me. But what is also true and very powerful is that I want to be helpful. I want to be useful. I give a shit. And my job on the planet is to help people. And when I can tune into that, that is so much of a cleaner burning fuel than greed. And again, I'm not saying I don't have greed. I do. And I'm not vilifying self-interest. I don't vilify that. I have it. However, we all have in us the capacity for altruism. And I think that if you can tune into that, it will give you a kind of motivation that is hard to beat.
I think it's a good place for us to end. Yeah, so you mentioned danharris.com for the Substack, the new biz venture, and then obviously 10% Happier, wherever people get their podcasts. Anything else you'd like to plug?
No, thanks for letting me plug anything, but that certainly suffices.
Dan, this has been amazing. I wanted to thank you so much for your vulnerability and for sharing everything that you shared. I think the audience is going to really enjoy this conversation. I think it's going to help a lot of people. So I wanted to thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
Total pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Doug.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.